Hello and welcome to the Disability Entrepreneurs Festival. Today we're talking with Simon Darcy. Professor Simon Darcy specialises in developing inclusive practices for marginalised groups at the UTS Business School, University of Technology, Sydney. He is widely published across disability service provision employment and currently holds an Australian research grant examining disability entrepreneurship and self-employment in Australia. Simon has the lived experience of disability as a person living with high-level spinal cord injury who uses a power wheelchair. And I'll also mention that Simon's a member of the Disability Leadership Institute. Welcome, Simon. Thanks so much for being part of the festival.
Thanks, Christina, for the opportunity to have a chat today.
I've been really looking forward to this conversation because you're doing some of the only research that I'm aware of that's going on around disability entrepreneurship. What exactly have you been looking at?
Well, when we looked at the ABS figures, and I know you're aware of them, it showed that people with disability were about 40%, had 40% higher rates of self-employment than that of the general population. Yet the reason why that figure is there is a little unknown. So we were interested in talking to people and finding out what their experiences of self-employment or entrepreneurship were and what types of businesses they operated. We wanted to understand the extent to which disability entrepreneurs are embedded in family and personal social networks, and also the role of gender in entrepreneurship as well. We wanted to look at the networks that they were involved in from a disability service organisation establishment perspective, together with the nature and success of their entrepreneurship. Because entrepreneurship actually, in the general business sense, has a rather high rate of failure, as does self-employment and small business. And we also wanted to look at a particular program, accelerator program, and follow the journey of people through that program. As you said, there's been some work done overseas. We believe this study is the first major study in Australia to understand what the entrepreneurial ecosystem looks like for people with disability. Yeah,
and you're using that term entrepreneurial quite broadly, aren't you? What exactly do you mean by that?
Yes, well, we're using it. We're using the definition to be very inclusive of also self-employment, that is, performing work for personal profit rather than for wages paid by others. And we're using that as a starting point because we found that a lot of people who were entrepreneurial, who did have their own businesses, didn't actually recognise that they were entrepreneurs in the sense of a process of, creating, discovering, evaluating and exploiting opportunity to create future goods and services, whatever that happened to be. And within that entrepreneurial space, there's a particular 5 or 7 stage process that the entrepreneurial theory will look at. And many people with disability just didn't see themselves as entrepreneurs, but had created their own businesses, whether that be service-based or goods and service-based. Or the other area that we're interested in also, not dissimilar to yourself, is around social entrepreneurship and social enterprise in this space. The other category that we've come across, and we didn't realise that it would be also a major area to look at, is what's regarded as a micro enterprise, which is essentially a very small business enterprise that's started with minimal capital, and it may be a minor contribution to the overall financial resources of the individual. And in the case of a great deal of the micro enterprises, it weaves itself in between what may be the disability support pension and getting income that doesn't contravene the various welfare regulations around what you're able to earn on top of a disability support pension, in the case of those people that are receiving either that or other forms of welfare.
Right. So it is quite a broad space, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It is. And that broadness, we believe, gives us an avenue on which to look at a continuum of enterprise and also identify where there may be areas that are problematic, areas where there are barriers, identify what people have identified as enablers to break through those barriers that people experience, and also just document what the journey of individuals are. Why is it that they came to take on self-employment, which does take more work than a salaried job because you are it, and it's a responsibility. And some of those experiences with the people we've interviewed and also people who responded to the survey, there is a great deal of commonality around the motives, and there is also a tremendous complexity based on not just disability type, but the level of support needs of individuals. So we're seeing a complex matrix rather than just, well, I couldn't get a job. It's a much more complex process to understand.
Right. It's interesting. I am interested in what you've been finding. Some of, the broader understanding around entrepreneurs is that they're really driven people who have a particular bent for running the show themselves and want to do something. Is there a commonality between the broader entrepreneurship ecosystem and disability entrepreneurs in that regard?
Yeah, and depending on what you've read, certainly. With one of the theorists in the area, Ciroli believes entrepreneurs are passion-driven first and foremost. Our research has been showing that while there are those people with disability who are purely passion-driven, that a great deal of entrepreneurs with disability have turned to self-employment and entrepreneurship simply because of what's expressed in the literature as blocked mobility. And that's quite simply that either the 9-to-5 salaried workforce hasn't been able to accommodate their needs, or they have simply banged their head against a bloody brick wall for so long that they've said, look, we're just going to do it for ourselves. For others, and maybe there's a little bit of an NDIS aspect to it, given that there may be a great deal more money splashing around the system around disability now. But there are certainly a lot of really interesting, what's also described in the literature as user-led, that is, people with disability that can see a gap in the market for some form of enterprise filling the gap for people with disability. And that might be goods, although we're predominantly seeing service-led businesses. And it may be around awareness training, for example.
Yep.
Or there is another group of people who've created very good careers over a fairly long period of time now around access support for the built environment. So they're part of the environmental planning system and have fitted into various niches. That is a little bit state dependent as well. So New South Wales has certainly got a position in there for access auditors. And so the Australasian Consultants in Access Australia, for example, are an organisation that have got a lot of professional members that are people with disabilities with their own business.
So What are some of the key findings you've been coming across with your recent research?
Yeah, what's been interesting is that, and just to give you just a brief idea of the sample we've been speaking to, so about 50% of people have been with some form of mobility or physical disability, 20% hearing, 8% intellectual other, 5% mental health, 5% vision. So we've got a spectrum there. What's been maybe not surprising is that about 32% of those people regard themselves as independent and able to really function socially without any real form of support needs. And the 34% have a low level of support needs, and 15% medium. So people with high or very high support needs seem to lag within this area, and also have the highest rates of unemployment. But when it comes to the sectors that entrepreneurs with disability have positioned their businesses in, first and foremost is the area of healthcare and social assistance. And I should explain that I used the ABS categorization so we were able to compare directly.
Yeah.
Secondly, education and training. Third, and this is an interesting one, professional, scientific and technical services. So, you know, we've got some really good geeks with disability out there doing some really cool stuff.
Oh, yes, we
High
do.
degree of technical knowledge.
Yep.
And that's a very important area. And then one that I found surprising was in the area of arts and recreation services. And certainly we know that through accessible arts, etc., artists with disabilities have moved along the spectrum from maybe getting some therapeutic or recreational introduction, but are now getting career development opportunities through specialist grant programs that are being offered, and in effect are as employable as any artist if they have the skill for either performing arts, sculpture, painting, whatever it happens to be, because most artists are unemployed a fair amount of the time and fall back on some form of other secondary employment. And then the final one I'll mention is the whole information media and telecommunications area. So they're the largest areas of employment, but with some really interesting ones. For example, slightly off to the left of that one, digital animation, virtual reality. So some really high-tech stuff. But then other ones breaking the barriers of working in what would be regarded as manual labour, people that build swimming pools, truck drivers, people making the workforce fit for themselves.
That's really interesting, isn't it? Because apart from the incredibly broad range of employment there that you've just described, and that really is incredibly broad, I often come across an assumption that disabled people are very much centred around things relating to disability. You know, that and particularly our businesses are very related to disability. And what you're telling us is that isn't the case at all. It's in fact, it's not like that. There's an incredibly wide range of ways that people get out there and get self-employed and start to hopefully employ others. And something I have heard, and I wonder where your research has shown up here, is disability entrepreneurs are more likely to employ other disabled people. Is there anything that you've come across there?
Yeah, we've certainly got those figures. So going beyond self-employment and sole traders, there are a proportion of businesses that employ people with disability, and those statistics will be available in a public report quite soon. And if the other outcome that a lot of entrepreneurs with disability say they want to do with their businesses is also give back. So giving back comes in many forms, but one of them being employing others with disability who they recognise as having the skills and ability to fit into those business frames. That also flows on from the motivations that are there as well. So I'll briefly talk about motivations and then go on to those benefits. So, and again, I'm just looking to my right just to make sure I'm getting it right. So first and foremost, to be their own boss was the key motivation. And then the second one, following on from what you just said, is to help others. Now, that's not, that doesn't come through as strongly in other non-disabled entrepreneurial stuff. Right. The third one, and I think a lot of us might resonate with, is to have a flexible work schedule and lifestyle. Now, I found, being in academia, that the academic life can be quite flexible outside teaching. And so flexibility is really important for a lot of us. I know for myself, a breakfast meeting is a no-go zone for me. I'm not going to do a breakfast meeting. The other aspect that they're motivated by, well, look, I want to try something where I'm going to push myself and learn new skills. And then the fifth one, and not surprisingly, is an opportunity for financial success. So either to break that welfare cycle, etc.
Yeah.
Now, when it comes down, and I'll just sit down just a little bit, what are the outcomes being? And these are really interesting. It provides a sense of purpose, a sense that individuals can see that they have a future, that they want to contribute back to the community, that the job, the business creation itself has improved the way they feel about themselves, so that's self-esteem. And generally, even though anyone that runs their own business knows that they're bloody busy, that they believe that they've had an improved quality of life, and they feel happier in their disposition once they've made that commitment and they're doing that hard work.
That's really interesting. That tallies a lot with what we hear from members of the Disability Leadership Institute, who say very much similar things, and certainly I'd have to say my own experience is not dissimilar to that. That's really fascinating. Yeah. We were talking earlier before we started about finance. It's a big area, and I'm interested because, if we're more likely to be entrepreneurs or self-employed than the broader population, there's an awful lot of startup support incubators these days, accelerators, those sorts of activities, and many of that is both state and federal government supported. What have you discovered about finance and how disability entrepreneurs fund their enterprises or their businesses, and what their experience is of gaining access to money? What have you found there?
I think let's go back to those definitions for a minute around self-employment and entrepreneurship. A great deal of self-employment, people have always funded themselves. So people that are going through more of an entrepreneurial process are exposed to other areas in which to gain finance. So I think what we're finding in the study is there is a differentiation between those who identify as being self-employed and those identify as being entrepreneurs. And our stats showed that of the major funding sources, and this is some of these stats I'm going to read out now, are what are called multi-response. So that is, people can choose 1, 2, 3, 4,
Right.
5, or whatever applies to them. So it totals to more than 100. So almost 80% said that they were using their own cash contributions. A further 20% family and friends. The third most popular at 15% was a bank loan. A lot of people identified major problems with getting access to loans and finance in general. Others were funding the development of the business on multiple credit cards.
Ooh.
Yes.
Ooh, that's
So credit cards were there. Of only 10% identified some form of state government grant. 10% some form of private equity or venture capital. 7% said some form of local government or a smaller number federal government. So we're really seeing that those people are not dipping into those specific areas that are available or they're exposed to with entrepreneurship. So, for example, crowdfunding on various Australian platforms where you've been exposed is only about 4%. And other more complex forms of financing weren't evident in the study. Now, within the levels of government, I'm not able to give you a breakdown as to whether they were specific entrepreneurial programs that they got their money from. But in the qualitative data, we're just starting to tease that out because people have provided that level of detail.
Yeah. So is it possible at this point to identify that it is harder to source funds if you're a disability entrepreneur, or is it about the same as the rest of the population, or what would you say? Just
the other data source that we've got, and where that data is almost ready to talk about, but there is a difference between non-disabled entrepreneurs and entrepreneurs with disability, and that's a comparative data set that we've drawn from that will be publicly available soon. And it has shown that people with disability are relying more on their own wherewithal and family and friends, not to a massive extent, and we're not able to say to a statistically significant extent, but there is definitely a pattern difference.
Right.
In that reliance and using other sources.
Yes, and certainly we'll be sharing any of your outcomes through the Disability Leadership Institute Entrepreneurs page when that's available, because people really are fascinated by it. We're just about out of time, Simon. Is there a big thing that you came across with the data that you were surprised by?
Look, I'll give you the key outcomes or the key messages that we have presented to our industry partners as well. And I must give a little bit of a plug for those industry partners. Settlement Services International, National Disability Services, and Breakthrough People Solutions.
Certainly.
Who were part of the linkage grant. And I must say, linkage grants also leverage money of organisations at about 4 to 1. So you get for one lot of industry money, for lots of government money, for anyone thinking about the research, of course. So one of the 6 key messages that came through in the research, entrepreneurs with disability lamented the lack of entrepreneurial education available. So a lot of people had spoken about, geez, if I just knew before I made that mistake. And so the education space was made more complex because educational programs weren't necessarily inclusive. Now, that could be physically inclusive, like something as simple as what I mentioned before, a range of activities occurring early morning, or it could be through alternative information, or it could be something as simple as building accessibility as well. So education's one. Second one is what we're doing here today. That is networking and making available. So the first two are what we're doing today. So respondents didn't feel they had the same networking opportunities as their non-disabled entrepreneurial brothers and sisters had, either not knowing about what those opportunities were, or similarly just not having those opportunities close to where they were. Proximity means that you're more likely to go ahead.
That's interesting, because we've found that in the broader disability leadership space. That's been some outcomes of our surveys as well, that one.
Well, and Australia's a big country, and even within the big metropolitan cities, and I'm living in Sydney. It's now 5:15, so I'm not going to bother even trying to go home before 6:30. Transport issues still are major issues for a lot of us.
Yes.
And that's that's tricky to deal with. The third one is government, social services, and bureaucracy. So there is a belief by many that the social safety net's important, but it can also be stifling for people starting their business and what occurs with cash flows if you're on any form of welfare or support pension. Entrepreneur, self-employment, the cash flow can be quite uneven at the beginning, and you have to do a lot to maintain contact with the bureaucracy. Similarly with NDIS, there's been a lack of clarity around what they can do for self-employment or entrepreneurial education, and those messages haven't been consistently clear coming out from NDIS. So that's one that hasn't popped up in overseas studies as much. While there's discrimination in mainstream employment or block mobility, that it points to a whole series of issues with culture and attitude that still come across into the self-employment and entrepreneurial space as well. So while you're maintaining greater control and you're in an endeavour that you're really enjoying, you still are dealing with attitudes around your abilities within a self-employment and entrepreneurial space.
Yeah.
There's two more. The fifth one is the importance of family, friendship circles in getting those businesses off the ground and supporting the individual. This is very similar to other marginalised groups. So my other chief investigator, Jock Collins, has done work with Indigenous communities, with entrepreneurs from CALD backgrounds, and also with refugees currently. Right. And so the importance of an individual being supported by partners, family, friends in that startup phase is incredibly important. So if you don't have those networks, and everybody knows with business that broader social capital that comes with those connections, then doing business is really difficult. So in the beginning, family and friends, and then having those networks, that bridging capital, to extend your business out further.
Yes.
And the last one we've already spoken about, and that is access to financial services, so that they're able to grow or scale up their business and get the support that's required in a timely fashion. And if you haven't had an employment background, if you don't have a decent credit record, then you're going to find it far more difficult to get that finance.
Absolutely. So much there, isn't it? I'm really looking forward to seeing where some of your further reports come through, Simon. We're pretty much out of time. I like to ask a final question of all of our interview people when we get to it, and that is, who is a leader you admire and why?
Wow. I'm one of these people that have been around the sport business crossovers. So there was a business leader on the Northern Peninsula, a fellow called Rod McQueen, who went on to coach the Wallabies, but had also done some very good work lately with a Sargood Foundation, and in kicking off a wonderful enterprise associated with spinal cord injury and rural rehabilitation that shows a very successful business entrepreneur in his own right in the printing industries, but takes a very robust leadership role, both within sport, but also in giving back to the community. So I've always enjoyed that discipline and that crossover area, and think that Rod McQueen's a great example that anyone with or without a disability can take. The disability space is a really interesting one. I was very lucky to be involved in organisations like Physical Disability Council when it kicked off in New South Wales. People like Kevin Burns, John Boxon were very important, and also Joan Hume was a tremendous person that I had a great deal of fondness for, and also being a fellow educator, I had many terrific conversations. And it's really important for all of us to have people that we look up to.
Most certainly it is. Simon Darcy, thanks so much for your time today and for being part of the Disability Entrepreneurs Festival.
Thanks very much, and keep an eye out for further research.
We certainly will.